Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me today as we talk a little bit about metrics. So I want to start to say is that I think a lot of us, we really love metrics, don't we? They're all over life, but particularly in a year following or 2 years following coronavirus, where we've seen a lot of graphs and charts and statistics that we've got to sort of make sense of. But in our work life, we see them probably more than a lot. But why? I think probably firstly because they're objective. You can make sense of it. You can try to prove a point with something. So compare these two statements. A software team increased its velocity over the last quarter. With this one, the software team improved its velocity by 15.3% over the last quarter. Well, if it was possible to measure that to that degree of accuracy, but you get the point. Secondly, we have a lot of systems that we use that come with statistics and dashboards that we can slice and dice and present data. So it's easy to come by. And for those of us who are engineering leads and managers, it's imperative that we measure things, right? And we measure things because of this type of thinking, that there is a relationship between metrics and management and delivery. We measure things to play into things like performance management of our teams. We want to see what good teams are doing. We do it to replicate good across the organization. This team is performing well at this metrics. We want all our teams to do that. So what are they doing? And we often do it because we believe it's the right thing for us to do as leaders and managers, because well, that's what our stakeholders want us to do. Our CEO wants to get a sense of what our teams are doing, why they're spending so much money. So I want to give you a few examples. So apologies for those who are not from the UK. These examples are UK-based, but if you're not from the UK, I'm probably sure you've got similar examples in your space. So both the NHS and the UK Department for Education have a lot of metrics that they use to measure performance, and they're widely publicised and scrutinised. And, well, for good reason. We spend a lot of money as a nation on these areas, and a lot of people want to know, well, what they're getting for it. What's the value for their money? So they publicise them, and you can go online and find them out. But these are two related to some of the ones related to waiting times and performance in reading, writing, and maths. Now, after they were introduced, we saw some very positive results. And you could see on these sort of graphs that the waiting time for outpatient care falls below the 18-week target. And those waiting for longer of a year falls quite significantly. And it makes sense. And on the right-hand side, those achieving the right level in reading, writing, and maths also increased. And the graphs clearly show that the implementation of these targets, these metrics, had a positive effect. Because, well, schools and hospitals couldn't hide behind poor performance. They were very visible to everyone. And then the idea was where they didn't meet those targets, the government could focus its attention and give extra support and resources to those that didn't achieve the target. But, and there's always a but, sadly the rates didn't always stay like that. This is what happened to the wait times in the years afterwards. It was a worrying trend upwards. And worse still, in the UK, the Mid-Staffordshire hospital crisis was something that became notorious. Now, Mid-Staffordshire was a hospital that was keen to have what we call foundation status. And this was where they were in charge of their own destiny. They had autonomy. They could make their own decisions. They were outside of the control of central government. But in order to do that, they needed to meet these government targets on wait times. So what they were starting to do was that they were doing a couple of things. First of all, they were altering the records to make it see that they achieved the wait times. But secondly, surgeons were really encouraged to focus on those ones that were close to the wait times rather than the ones who were needed it more clinically necessary to be operated on at that time. And what happened was that it was awarded foundation status because it met these targets, while level of care plummeted and death rates actually soared. And that's the danger of focusing on one metric to the detriment of other metrics. In the education world, there was a similar issue. 10 or 11-year-olds were coached for 6 months of their final year at primary school to pass the standard achievement tests. And schools would really focus on coaching those who were on the borderline between making the grade and not making the grade because it reflected on them. They would ignore the very capable, not stretching them, the ones at the top, and those at the bottom who weren't going to meet that level, they were also ignored. And in both cases, doctors and teachers sacrificed what they knew to be right in terms of doing the right thing and allowing pupils to thrive in patient care. Why? Because metrics drives behavior. It's obvious, isn't it? That's why we put them in place. We want people to know them, we want them to understand them, and we want them to do something about it. However, what we sometimes see is that the behavior that it drives isn't the one that we anticipated, or it overemphasizes one behavior over another, over a host of other behaviors. So, the metric on waiting time wasn't a bad metric to try to implement, but when it became the sole focus over patient care, it clearly was. So what we see time and time again is that metrics that we can put in place alters behavior, and some of that behavior is sometimes dysfunctional. People don't want to adhere to the metrics, and so they do various things, like they try to sort of game it. Alternative is that people impact measurement. In some reasons, they don't like the sort of behavior that they have to do, and that behavior is dysfunctional. So far, we've looked at metrics in the public domain, but what about in our world, in the world of software? Well, we love metrics too, probably more than most. And there's a load of metrics since the agile revolution. We've got lots of metrics that we use. So cycle time, mean time to recovery, velocity, that type of thing. Now, I've worked in software for over 20 years, and I want to show you a few examples of where people have tried to put in metrics to improve performance of teams. I want to then talk through what the unintended consequences were. So the first one I want to talk about is something called the happiness indicator. You may have something similar in your organization. It's quite common where teams rate themselves on a score of 1 to 5 on a monthly basis maybe, and they submit those scores. They're all collated, the average calculated, and the average for that team is looked at. And the idea is because, in general, we know that generally happy teams are more productive teams, and so we want to see high scores. But what if the leader of that team, and I've seen this happen, thought that if their teams were scored lowly, that would reflect badly on them and the team? And in that case, they encouraged the team to artificially score the team highly. And that just showed that, they didn't trust in the managers who were reviewing the scores to do the right thing by it. The second one that I've got is around velocity or any other metric associated with sort of velocity. So cycle time or velocity. And the idea is we want to increase the velocity because that shows we're being more effective as our software teams. And we're maybe focusing on better agile principles. But what can happen sometime is that people will game those story points, we've probably seen it, or worse, cut quality to hit those velocity targets. Thirdly is something called the redevelopment rate. This was a metric that was put in place basically to try to reduce the number of times a defect went back into development following testing. And that's a good thing to do. We want to make sure that our developers focus on doing quality work and getting that right the first time. What tended to happen was there would be then arguments about, well, was that defect related to my original ticket or was it something else? And so it set developers and testers up against each other. And my final is my favorite, and this is back quite some time when building and releasing software actually took quite a long time to do. And it's something that was created, which is called the Build Break Hall of Shame. And what happened was that every time a developer broke the build, they'd get a point. And these were displayed on a league table in the room. And the worst culprits were at the top of the league table. And the idea was that we wanted, again, people to think hard and focus on sort of quality in terms of what they were doing. But the consequence we got was that people would either wait a long time or check things in one big go. And this is the problem of narrowing focus, because if I think about my software team, there's loads of things that I want them to do well. Probably about 20 or more things. I want them to write clean code, to test thoroughly, to deliver on their commitments, to respond to outages, to find, prioritize, and to fix bugs, to improve performance, to reduce technical debt, to think innovatively and creatively, to respond timely to stakeholders. I want them to work together, focusing on their strengths. I want them to learn new skills. I can't have a metric for all of these things, can I? If so, then where would the focus be for my team? So what tends to happen is we focus on 2 or 3 of the really poor things that we're doing and try to improve them. Well, that's a good idea, but what about when some of those metrics lie in tension with each other? For example, delivery rate and quality, or delivery rate and innovation. So we can clearly see that metrics can drive some pretty poor behavior, sometimes even to the exact opposite of the behavior that we wanted to. So given all this discussion so far, I'm advocating a no metrics approach to leading software teams, rather like the no estimates movement that existed within the world of software estimation. Well, no, I believe that there can be that darker downside, but I think that there is room for for metrics in the right places. But I also think there are other things that we can do that are more beneficial for our teams than solely focusing on just estimates. So what I'm just going to do to finish off with now is just to give you a few sort of ideas and pointers of the sort of things that I think can work well. In general, I think we just need to use our common sense and be aware of the pitfalls. And I think if we've done that, we've made some good steps in this whole topic. So in the NHS example, treat patients based on their clinical priority, and then focus on those who've waited the longest. And then, firstly, I think if a metric is good if it's in an environment of trust. And I often say this a lot in some of the talks that I give, that it's all about trust. And that's because in our teams, we're humans and humans in relationships, and trust is a really key factor. If we trust the people who are collecting the metrics not to do something bad with it, that it doesn't reflect bad, they're going to bash us over the head if we score poorly against a particular metric, for example, the happiness indicator, then we're more likely to just go along with it and do what we do the right thing. But we just need as leaders to keep reinforcing that idea that we're not using it for nefarious purposes. Secondly, I think it's good if it's defined from the bottom up. If you've got an engaged team, they know what the right things to focus on. They know where value really lies. Get them to define the metric and support them where you can. I think if it's used as a trend over absolute numbers, I think that can be helpful, so we don't fixate on the number. And by that, what we can see is then if we see people, if the trend is going towards what we want, we can see, well, what have we just changed that accelerated that, and maybe do more of it. If you start to see a trend away from the desired state, then look at, again, what was causing that. And in general, I'd advocate using shorter tracking periods and stop using a metric when it adds no more value. Another way of focusing on metrics so that you don't over-index on one against another metric, those ones that lie in tension, is to create what's called a balanced scorecard. Now, a balanced scorecard, a traditional one in a business sense, is where you look across 4 discrete areas of your business. So it'd be financial, customer value, internal processes, and learning and growth. And I would advocate in our engineering departments using something similar. And then we can get away from this idea that we can have things that are in tension with each other, like quality and delivery rates. Now, most of us will never be in the position to put in place the sort of metrics that drove the catastrophic effects that the Mid-Staffordshire Hospital, but I imagine most of us at some point will be asked to devise metrics to improve our software team's performance. Can I ask that when you're in that position, that at first you do an exhaustive exercise over all the unintended consequences you might have of putting that metric in place. And then if you've done that, and knowing your teams as you did, then support them, predict the likelihood of that happening, and then put the metric in place. Talk it over with your team, explain why you're doing it transparently so that you develop trust. And finally, I've talked about metrics, I've talked about the use of metrics. If that's something of interest to you, I'd love to carry on the discussion, particularly if you've put a metric in place that you feel has really driven the improvement of a software team. So that's me. I'm the head of engineering at Qogita. If what I've described is the sort of environments that you'd like to work in, we're very much hiring right now. You can come and chat to us at our stand afterwards or during one of the breaks, and you can even try to win a Lamborghini, a Lego version. Thank you.